Spotlight is a production of CTNY, the Catholic television network of Youngstown. It seeks to spotlight people, places, and events from around the Diocese of Youngstown that promote the new gospel of joy called for by Pope Francis. Your program host is Father James Korda.
Welcome to our show, Promise to Protect, Pledge to Heal. I'm Father Jim Korda. Joining me is Bishop George Murry. Welcome to our show.
Thank you, Father. I'm happy to be with you.
You know, Bishop, the clergy sexual abuse issue affects all of us. What can you tell us as a bishop how it affects you, and what can you do pastorally for us?
Well, it affects me personally, and it affects the bishops personally in a variety of ways. This is such a sad chapter in our history, and I think that any of us who are ordained know somebody who has been caught up in this both immoral and criminal behavior. We also know victims, and we know what they have gone through. And I've often said to people, there are some people who have been the victim of abuse, and it's rolled off their back like the way water rolls off the back of a duck's back. Others have been seriously affected by this, and I think this is the majority of the people. Their lives have been uprooted and sometimes destroyed. From a pastoral standpoint, we have to be very, very clear that this is not acceptable behavior. It is not only immoral, it is also criminal. And we as the church have to do everything possible to prevent this from happening again and care for the victims.
Let's go back to that word prevention. It's kind of sad that we're in that mode, that we have to prevent something like that because we would think that that would not be part of who we are. But
yes.
Unfortunately, it is. What are some of the steps that you can take or that we as a church can take to prevent this?
Well, first of all, we have the Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People, which was approved by the U.S. bishops and then authorized by the Vatican in 2002. That charter calls upon all of us to be aware of this problem and take action. Here in our diocese and across the country, for example, every person who is involved with children, from the teacher in a school all the way down to the maintenance person, anyone who has contact with children has to go through the Virtus program of child prevention, and there are monthly updates that are sent out. There are a number of talks that are given to people so that they can recognize abuse and know how to report it. And then in each one of our schools and our religious education programs, there are deliberate and very conscious programs for the children so that they understand what abuse is. They know how to report it to a teacher or to a principal or a pastor. And then we as a diocese can be vigilant, and we have to be vigilant because some of the people who get involved in this are unbelievably dishonest. And so we've got to be vigilant to protect those children.
We want to let the folks know that in later shows we will talk about the Virtus program, but also about the Dallas Charter as well. Let's go back to those who are intimately affected by this. Let's talk about the victims. I'm sure in your pastoral experience you've come in contact with victims of child sexual abuse. What do you say to them, and what can you say to them?
Well, first of all, some victims of child sexual abuse have written or called or sent an email. They've either had an experience here in the Diocese of Youngstown or they've had an experience somewhere else. I recently received a call from a man from Columbus, and he simply didn't know who to call. And so he looked at the bishops of Ohio and found my name and decided to call. The first thing you have to say to a person in that situation is how sorry we are that this ever happened. You have to listen to the person. You have to hear the person's story. You have to understand the situation they were in that led to this. And many times they will say that they were afraid to come forward. They were hesitant to come forward because they didn't want to be judged. You can't judge a person in that situation. You simply have to help them pick up the pieces of their life. And that's why myself and Msgr Zuraw and Delphine Baldwin-Casey, our staff for child protection, we listen very carefully to these people. We try to walk with them, and we offer them counseling. Some people say, I don't need counseling, I'm fine. Other people say, I would really appreciate that.
In our last few minutes of our time together, one of the words that or phrases that really often comes up is, it's been a breach of trust in the church.
Oh, very much so.
How do we begin to kind of level that breach that has taken place?
Well, breach of trust is a very serious comment, and I do hear that a lot. And when I do parish visits or I do confirmations, one of the things that always impresses me is how much the people, the young people and the adults, trust their pastor. Sure. And when that trust is damaged, that's where you have a very, very serious problem. I think we help to heal that damage by communicating, for example, through this program to our people, that we are taking this seriously, we are taking action, and that all of us as priests and lay people must work together to rebuild that trust.
In just a few moments, Bishop, what would you say about those who are preparing for priesthood now, preparing our seminarians well so these things don't happen again?
Well, all the bishops of Ohio and the bishops across the country have met with their seminary rectors, and there are programs in place to, first of all, psychological studies to make sure our seminarians don't have any tendencies in this direction, but also ongoing programs every year so that they're aware and that they know what steps to take. The seminarians are very aware of that trust factor and the loss of that trust factor, and they want to do everything they can to communicate to people that they can be trusted and then live up to that expectation.
In closing, what would you tell the folks that are with us about what you're doing specifically as a bishop for the church locally, but also worldwide?
Well, what I'm trying to do is to bring this out into the open so that nothing is hidden. We've released the names of those who have offended in this way since 1943, since the diocese was created. One of the things which I think is really helpful in this situation is our review board. We have a group of professionals, doctors, lawyers, people who are expert in working with children, parents, victims, coming together. And when an allegation comes in, this is taken very seriously. It's investigated by a group of former FBI agents. They make a recommendation to the review board. The review board looks over it and then makes a recommendation to me as to whether or not that person should be removed from ministry. I'm also working with the priests to communicate to them how serious this is and how we have to take action and take action across the board.
Thank you, Bishop. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Whether it's passing on medicine, a blanket, or something as simple as a glass of water, that's how compassion works. And that's how Maryknoll works, hand to hand to hand. For nearly 100 years, Maryknoll's been passing on your help to the priests and brothers working in 26 countries around the world. Maryknoll, an American Catholic organization, dedicates 86 cents of every dollar donated to their programs, serving the world's poor and powerless. And that's how it works. Compassion flows from your hand to the hand of someone in need. Hand to hand to hand. That's Maryknoll.
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 That's Maryknoll. What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I bought her an orchid.
What have I done for my marriage today? I sent my husband a love email.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. She's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Make a change for the better. Need help? Go to foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
Welcome back to our show, Promise to Protect, Pledge to Heal. Joining me now is Msgr. John Zuraw. Welcome.
Thank you, Father Korda.
You know, the question that I asked Bishop Murry in the beginning of his segment is a question I'd like to begin with you. Clergy sexual abuse affects all of us. Mm-hmm. How does it affect you personally as a priest?
Well, there's a greater awareness of what is going on in society, what is going on within the church. You know, when I was ordained 31 years ago, this was not a great issue. 2000, it became first and foremost in most of our lives. So the awareness that I have is how other individuals see me as a priest, what is their opinion of me as a priest, and then how do I most effectively communicate a positive understanding of priesthood to those around me.
And before we get into our discussion about some of the policies that surround the issue, I'd like to take it a step further. What could you say, or what can we say to our brother priests who might be experiencing difficult times because of the greater issue?
I think one aspect in which we can be of support to our brother priest, that there is a coming together, that we're not individuals all alone, but we're a unified group for a common purpose, and that is to spread the gospel.
Let's talk about the policies. We know that probably most, if not every diocese in the country has a policy for child sexual abuse. What is our policy and how old is the policy?
Right. Our policy goes back to 1994 under Bishop Malone. The policy was entitled To Protect Children Against Sexual Abuse. Then when the year 2000 came about, and especially in 2002, when the bishops created their charter, each and every diocese was to implement the norms of the charter and the particular aspects of that charter into the diocese. And that's what we did within the Diocese of Youngstown. You and I are aware of the Treasurer's Gift from God. We had an opportunity to produce our own videos and educational component. We have since changed that to Virtus, but that was a very good start because that indicated not only education, but prevention for child sexual abuse.
We're going to talk about Virtus in another show, but let's go back to the policy itself. How has the policy of 1994 changed to the present policy?
It has become more complete. It's based now on the Dallas Charter established by the bishops, and it allows us to look at various aspects. How do we as a diocese respond to allegations that come forth? The importance of reporting, the importance of proper ministerial behavior. I think one of the aspects that is most important is that healing and reconciliation component within the policy. How do we bring forth healing to those individuals who have been abused by a member of the clergy?
In your experience, has that healing been difficult or has it been fulfilled?
For some individuals, it has been fulfilled. For other individuals, the healing takes time, and it is a very difficult process because what I have learned over the last 20 years is often the victim blames himself or herself. What could I have done to stop this abuse? So once they get into their minds and hearts that they were the victim and they were victimized, then and only then can the healing begin.
When we talk about being a victim, how deep does that go? And we're talking young children, so we know that psychologically there's a lot to wrap your mind around. Does one ever really get over something like that?
I truly believe one does not ever get over it, but they learn how to deal with it in everyday life. From my experience, what I have found is that in the Diocese of Youngstown, a lot of our cases are older cases. And the individuals have come forward now that they're in their 50s, 60s, 70s. They had all that time that they needed to process what had occurred. And, we do not rush victims when they come forward. That's when we offer counseling and the assistance of the diocese to help them. Civilly, the statute of limitations might be over with, but we have a pastoral responsibility for the victim and their families to continue the healing and reconciliation.
Briefly, why are policies like this so important?
Policies such as this invite us that we can never say that we've completed the project, but rather we continue to learn, we continue to develop new ways in which the healing aspect of our ministry continues.
Let's talk very briefly in our last few minutes of our time together about the sacrament of confession, because in our ministry we sometimes come into contact with those who confess that. What do we do, or what do you tell priests in that situation?
I think one of the most important aspects is that, number one, we don't rush the confession, but rather we take time in order to, whether it is the victim or the perpetrator, to get them to the point where they're willing to speak about the situation outside the sacrament of reconciliation. And I think that is in self the healing aspect. That gets them over the hill to simply say, now I'm ready to articulate this. They know that they have been forgiven by God. Now, especially for the victim, they need to know that they forgive themselves, that they were not the cause of the situation. Now, for the individual who perpetrated the behavior, to help them realize the seriousness of the situation and, the healing that must take place also within their lives, that they need to take responsibility for their actions.
In our last minute, what would you tell those victims who may not have come forward, who may still be holding this tremendous pain?
Okay. It's not your fault. And because it's not your fault, you're going to move further once you articulate it. And do not see yourself as the blaming agent. Because what we have learned is that for some cases, you were not the only victim. And that will help other victims come forward and tell their story.
We're going to take a quick break. Please stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. The Society of St. Paul announces a new book on Padre Pio by Italian journalist Stefano Campanella. The director of Padre Pio Television gives readers an intimate insight into this saint who Pope Francis appointed as one of the great patrons of the Jubilee Year of Mercy. This edition can be found at St. Paul's Books and Gifts at 926 Boardman Poland Road, located across from the Olive Garden restaurant. This book on Padre Pio talks about his time in the sacrament of confession with countless of Catholic pilgrims, and as a contemplative saint whose life was blessed in countless ways. Visit St. Paul's Books and Gifts Monday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. or call 330-953-2443 or email at stpaulsbookstore@gmail.com to learn more about Padre Pio and many other great saints of the Catholic Church.
Well, I've been volunteering for 18, almost 20 years. What I do is help the elderly in their homes so that they can stay in their homes.
I think a lot of times the elderly in our society are forgotten, and that's unfortunate because they have so much wisdom to share.
The other day she told me that every night when she goes to bed, she thinks about her little angel, when her little angel's going to come and check on her the next day. And that's me, yeah.
Welcome back to our show, Promise to Protect, Pledge to Heal. Joining me now is Delphine Baldwin-Casey. Welcome to our show.
Thank you.
You know, the question that I had asked my previous guests is a question that I'd like to ask you. Clergy sexual abuse affects all of us. How does it affect you personally, but also as a layperson working in the church?
Well, it's something that sometimes I struggle with, no matter what my profession is. And all the years that I served on the Youngstown Police Department, the hardest cases for me were child abuse. I mean, it's very difficult to watch kids that are abused, especially by people they love and trust. Right. So it affects you. Yeah.
Let's kind of define child abuse. Give us like the age that we're talking about and what type of abuse are we really dealing with?
Child abuse can be defined as the physical maltreatment or sexual molestation of a child. But when we speak of child, we talk about someone who is under the age of 18. And if that person is physical or mentally impaired, it can be up until the age of 21.
Okay. When we talk about child abuse, especially within the church, which is why we're having this discussion, what are the procedures that someone like yourself or the church should take when they hear of an allegation?
Well, when there's an allegation of child abuse, most institutions should know the proper way to report it. So if a child reports an abuse, it's 3 ways that you can do it. The first way would be through Children's Services. You would want to report that abuse to them, and that's one of the boards I'm proud to say that I do serve on. The other way could be through Jobs and Family Services. You can report it that way, and of course you can definitely call your local police.
How important is it for us to be very upfront, especially in our reporting of what we hear that could be credible allegations?
Well, during my years of investigation, when someone reports a crime to me, I like to make that person feel that I believe what they're saying. That is very important, so that that person will open up to you, that person will trust you. Because one of the things that I truly feel, the worst abuse of any victim is their silence. So you want to be able to communicate to that person where they will open up to you.
One of the things that you had mentioned prior to the taping is that sometimes when someone who has been abused finally opens up about it, it's oftentimes years later. Why is that repression so much part of this terrible problem?
And I'm glad that you asked that question. That's probably the number one question that I'm asked. Why does it take a victim so long to come forward? There are many reasons, and what might be a reason for one person might not be the other. Sometimes there's that fear that was instilled in them as a child. If they tell, what will happen? The other one would be they might not be believed. There are many cases where a child has come forward, and because of the relationship to the person with the abuse, such as a family member, or it could be a clergy person, sometimes parents are not willing to believe what the child has said.
You know, that whole sense of believing children is, I would think, difficult for some adults, but I think in this world that we live in, and because of, unfortunately, some of the things that happen, we need to take that stance where we do believe them, not only for their welfare, but for their future as well.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about what is credible. What makes an allegation credible? Because I would imagine in your work that sometimes could be difficult.
It can be, but one of the things that we do as detectives or investigators, we go through training for when we're interviewing and knowing the difference between interviews and interrogation. So since for a long time that I've been more on the victim's advocate side, I do more of an interview with victims. I don't make them feel uncomfortable. I don't make them feel like I'm interrogating them or I felt like they are lying or have committed a crime. And in some cases, in the back of my mind, I probably know they did commit the crime, but it's just the way that you ask a person question. So when you're dealing with children, there's just ways that you have to ask them questions, and you want to be more indirect instead of saying, did your father do that? And you might say something like, okay, well, just tell me what happened when you were talking, to your father, or something like that. So there's ways to do things.
And I would imagine sometimes children might be more willing to talk to somebody that might not be a family member because of whatever reason, whether they might be embarrassed or just can't deal with that. So your role as someone who not only is trained but compassionately listens to them is going to be important.
Absolutely, and as they say, out of the mouths of babes, all right? There's so much truth when you listen to what children have to say. Yes.
Let's talk briefly about that whole sense of being vulnerable. We know that young children, in our experience, are rather impressionable. Going back to our own childhood, we looked up to certain people, and especially our parents and loved ones. And how important is it to be sensitive to children because of their vulnerability?
That's very important, because the vulnerability for children are definitely the people they trust, okay? And the one thing you don't want to make them feel ashamed that they've done something wrong, all right? And that's a very sensitive area. Even when you're discussing what they tell you about the person that has abused them. So for instance, if I'm working on a case, and let's say the child tells me it's the clergy person, they're very sensitive to that. They're still asking themselves, what did they do wrong? What did they say wrong? And why did this happen to me? So children are very vulnerable.
Delphine, Baldwin-Casey, unfortunately our time is up, but we thank you for your presence on our show today, but also for the work that you do, especially for the most vulnerable among us, and thank you for your help and assistance.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Spotlight has been a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father James Korda.